Yes, our children, we often identify them or characterize them as the forgotten mourners, the forgotten sufferers. I stand as the president of the board of Mothers in Charge, an organization founded by our executive director, Dorothy Johnson Spite, who founded the organization in 2003 after the murder of her son, Khalid Jabbar Johnson, in 2001, who was murdered over an argument over a parking space. Dorothy wanted something to do with her anger and her pain, and she often speaks about having a dream and in one of the moments where she was just feeling at her lowest and she saw the vision of all of these mothers coming together, standing against violence, and thus Mothers in Charge was birthed. I became introduced to Mothers in Charge in 2007. I had a friend whose son was murdered, and Mothers in Charge had reached out to her and invited her to grief support. And my friend asked me if I would join her, and I went to the grief support with her as a friend would do, because I could not begin to imagine the horrific feeling of losing a child. Because at that time, I had 3 sons. I had a son at that time who was 18, one who was 16, and one who was actually 23, and all 3 of them were in prison. And I knew they would be coming home to the streets, and I did not want to lose them to the grave. So I began to listen to Mothers in Charge. I began to listen to the experiences and the lived experiences of the mothers and fathers who have lost their children. And how can I become a part of a community? How can I become a part of the alliances? How can I become a part of the partnerships that had joined forces together to be able to put a dent or try to create some type of solutions to the systemic problem called gun violence within our community. So I was very excited about my role and the call to action and the charge that was given. But as life would have it, life had gotten so busy with my life, whether it was school or work, whatever the case may be. For what I did not tell you at the time, the son that was in prison that was 18 years old, he had been in prison since the age of 15 years old. And I remember having a conversation with him when he was about 14 years old, because he had begun to get involved with some older men who had not, who he had not been, who he should not have been involved with. And he was just going down a wrong path. And I heard the youth who they talked about being feared. They talked about the power, the false sense of power that they had when they picked up a gun. And I found out that my son was involved with guns. And I remember asking him, his name is Tyson, I said, Tyson, do you care whether you live or die? And he told me no. What was going on in his inner being? What was going on in his thought processes? What was going on in his own self-awareness that he could not see the value in his own life? So at the age of 15, a year later, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Charged with a murder that he was accessory to only because of the association with the adult men who had got him involved with the criminal activity. How do I count 99 years? So when life got so busy that I did not keep my charge or my commitment to Mothers in Charge, I continued just to do just life. And on April 14, 2010, my worst nightmare came true. I get a call at 1:30 in the morning that my youngest son, who had come home from prison at that time, he was 17 years old, he had come home. He came home in April of 2009. Less than a year later, he was murdered, shot over 14 times. Because at the age of 16 years old, which sends him to prison, he was involved with gang activity. But he had since come home. He was on his way to Penn State. He had graduated college, graduated high school, went on his prom, done all of those things, turning his life around. And he and I were driving down the street one day, and I remember him talking. He said, Mom, don't go down that street. And I said, his name was Solomon. Solomon, why? He said, because you don't know that the streets are calling me. How as a mother do I tell him not to answer when there's such a culture and a climate that captivates the minds, the lures of our children, of our youth, when they cannot identify with their own self-worth and value. All I can say was, Solomon, just don't do that. But it was bigger than that. It was only after his murder when everyone began to gather at my house, and he was well known nationally, and even on the football league and in the football team. And I remember his coaches in the football team came to my house after he had passed. His coaches came to me and they said, Solomon came to them and says, I'm in trouble. And they said, Solomon, well, what can we do to help? He said, it's nothing nobody can do. How do a child come up with an alternative that death is the only solution? That there's nothing nobody can do. We're talking about the impact of community on gun violence. The mothers, the fathers, the lawmakers, the government officials on every level, organizations such as Mothers in Charge. So I was indoctrinated, so to speak, into this organization because of the murder of Solomon Maurice Montgomery at the age of 19 years old. And it's such an irony because as I listen to Scott Charles talk about his program From the Cradle to the Grave, 2 years prior, Solomon was a part of their program. I remember bringing home to me the toe tag that they gave him in the program. And he said, Mom, this is what they said they put on us when we are murdered and when we die. And he and I began to have dialogue and we had discussion. But not knowing the forces that he had to deal with when he left the home every single day. These forces that these young ladies just talked about. So being a part of Mothers in Charge, not only do we advocate for education, for violence prevention and against gun violence, but a part of my role is not just consoling and counseling other mothers and families who have suffered the loss of losing a child to violence. But I also go into the prisons. I speak to mothers. I speak to men. I speak to juveniles who have been serving life sentences. How now do we get them to understand if they can change the cognitive aspect, their thinking, then the behaviors would change. Going into the schools with children as young as kindergartners and first grade, beginning to captivate them, to get their attention at such a young age, when their minds are very moldable and impressionable. We talked about there are many different aspects, many different elements that contribute to the gun violence. It's not just, it is very, very much the access, the climate and the culture of having access to guns. That our youth have access to a gun more readily than they do to school books. How did my 15-year-old son get access to a rifle that was given to the men who committed the crime? It was a neighbor. Found out it was the neighbor who sold my 15-year-old son the rifle. So I stand here as a grieved mother, but I also stand here as an advocate. I also stand here as a voice for the blood that cries out for my son and all of the other sons and daughters and the loved ones whose blood runs down the streets of Philadelphia, Chester, and all over this country. To be their voice, where their voice was silenced. Silenced by epidemic, yes, a public health crisis. Then we have to come together as a community to stand up together as one voice, a united voice, to put an end to gun violence. Thank you.